retired Navy SEAL moved deep into the snowy woods, hoping silence could bury the war still living inside him. Every morning, he sat by the window with black coffee, watching the pine trees and the snow fall in peace. But that morning, in the middle of the white forest, a small dark shape began moving toward his cabin. It was a little dog
Bram.
covered in snow and ice.
How did you get
as it
here?
reached the glass door and scratched for help. The old SEAL carried the dog inside, warmed it by the fire, and placed food in front of it. But the dog refused to eat, turned back toward the door, and begged him to follow. Then it led him deep into the woods, to a frozen crack in the earth where another tiny dog was trapped beneath the snow. Winter came gently to North Barrow, Maine that morning. It did not arrive like a punishment, nor like the old storms that slammed their fists against roofs and buried roads beneath white silence. It came softly, almost tenderly, laying snow over the pine branches until the forest looked washed clean by some patient hand. Beyond the trees, the frozen lake held the pale light of dawn. Above it, the sky stretched silver and quiet, as if the whole world were holding its breath before speaking. Eamon Rusk had always preferred mornings like that. At 58, Eamon was tall, around 6 feet even, with the lean, durable strength of a man shaped by years of hard ground, cold water, and orders carried out without applause. He was not bulky, not built like a man who admired himself in gym mirrors. His strength sat quietly in his shoulders, in the controlled way he moved, in the old discipline of his hands. His face was clean, shaven, showing a square jaw and high cheekbones that made him look sterner than he often meant to be. His hair, brown threaded heavily with white, was cut short in a military style, though a little longer than regulation now, as if even his hair had earned a small retirement. The northern wind had weathered his fair skin into a rougher, colder tan, and his gray-blue eyes held the distant calm of a man who had seen too much and learned to waste no movement. He wore the same kind of clothes almost every day, an old tactical combat shirt in dark gray black olive, the fabric softened by years of washing, the wrists and shoulders faintly frayed, the color faded by weather and time. His moss-green combat pants were worn at the knees, the cargo pockets sagging from use. Old military work boots sat heavy on his feet, and an old military watch circled his wrist, like the last command he still obeyed. Eamon had been a Navy SEAL before the word retired was placed beside his name like a quiet sentence. He had been released early after completing a classified mission that people in clean offices had called important. They gave him a handshake, a medal, and the kind of praise that sounded noble to everyone except the man who had carried the memories home, so he left. He bought a piece of lonely land 3 kilometers outside town, where there were no neighbors close enough to wave from windows, no crowds, no church ladies asking whether he was eating enough, no veterans at diners trying to guess which war lived behind his eyes. He built a small cabin himself at the edge of the woods, near the old lake road, and arranged his life around simple things: firewood, black coffee, repairs, weather, silence. Silence had been his chosen kingdom that morning, as always. He woke at 5:30. His body still kept military time, even when no one demanded it. He fed the stove, listened to the first dry crack of kindling, and brewed coffee strong enough to insult a weaker man. Then he sat at the large front window with the black mug in his hand, watching snow fall through the green ribs of the pines. Inside the cabin, everything had its place. 1 wooden table, 1 reading chair, 1 stove, 1 shelf of books, a folded map near the door, a coil of rope on a peg, tools hung in perfect order along the wall. There were no family photographs, no television murmuring in the corner, no friendly clutter to soften the room. Eamon did not hate people. He was simply tired of explaining why quiet felt safer than company. Outside, the snow brightened, and then something dark moved between the trees. Eamon lowered the mug an inch. At first he thought it was a loose tarp blown from someone's truck, or a blackened branch sliding over the snow. But the shape staggered. It moved with purpose, not with wind. It stopped, dipped, rose again, and came slowly toward the cabin. Eamon's body changed before his mind admitted concern. His shoulders set. His eyes narrowed. The old internal switch, the one he had thought the woods might finally rush shut, clicked on. The shape crossed the clearing. It was a dog, not a stray little farm mutt, not some soft house pet lost after chasing a squirrel. It was a male German shepherd, About 5 years old, full-grown but lean from hardship, his yellow-black coat crusted with snow. Now, ice clung in rough patches along his shoulders and chest. His black muzzle was dusted white, and his amber-brown eyes burned with a focus that did not belong to panic. His ears stood high, though one trembled slightly from cold. Around his neck was an old brown leather collar cracked from weather, with a scratched metal tag half hidden beneath frozen fur. He reached the front window and stopped. For a moment, dog and man looked at each other through the glass. The German shepherd did not bark. He did not bare his teeth. He lifted both front paws, placed them against the window, and scraped once. Then again, not wildly. Not like an animal begging, like a messenger knocking at the wrong-sized door. Eamon did not move at first. Something inside him tightened. German shepherds had a way of walking straight through old defenses, their ears, their watchful eyes, that grave loyalty in the face. It all belonged to a language he had once understood too well. A language he had stopped speaking after the last mission took more than his sleep. The dog pressed his forehead briefly to the glass, leaving a fogged oval of breath. And then Eamon saw it. The dog's left front leg shook, not from weakness alone, but from restraint. He was holding himself together, not for food, not for shelter. For something outside the cabin, Eamon stood. "Of course," he muttered, setting the coffee down. "God forbid anyone in this forest respect business hours." He opened the door, and Winter stepped inside. The German shepherd did not rush past him. He stood on the porch boards, breathing hard. Snow gathered over his back like ash from a cold fire. Up close, Eamon saw the dog's body more clearly. Strong working, lined frame, deep chest, powerful legs. But tired now. Not starving, not feral. Owned once, loved once, maybe, or trained. There was discipline in the way he held Eamon's gaze. Eamon crouched, slow enough not to challenge him. The dog sniffed his hand, then looked past him into the cabin. For half a second, Eamon thought the animal might enter, collapse by the stove, accept warmth like any sensible creature. Instead, the dog turned back toward the woods and gave a low, urgent whine. Eamon glanced at the fire, then at the dog. "No," he said. "Absolutely not." The German shepherd took 2 steps into the snow, stopped, and looked back. There was no command in the look. That was the terrible part. Commands could be refused. Orders could be judged. This was worse. This was trust offered before permission had been granted. Eamon felt an old ache stir beneath his ribs. He had heard cries for help in many forms, shouted across smoke, whispered through blood, coded over radios, prayed into the dark by men who did not believe in prayer until the last minute. But this dog made no dramatic sound. He simply stood in the snow and waited, as if he knew Eamon would hate himself forever if he closed the door. The dog turned suddenly and scraped at the porch again. Not the door this time, but the wood beside it. Eamon looked down. There, half buried in the powder, was a tiny paw print, then another, much smaller than the shepherd's, almost erased by fresh snow. For the first time that morning, Eamon felt the cold pass clean through his chest. Something else had been with him, something smaller. Something that had not reached the cabin. He grabbed his coat, flashlight, gloves, and the coil of rope from the peg by the door. The German shepherd watched every movement, then stepped aside as if acknowledging a man finally reporting for duty. "What's your name, soldier?" Eamon asked, mostly to steady himself. The tag on the collar swung as the dog moved. Ice covered most of it, but Eamon rubbed it clean with his thumb. "Bram, Eamon said quietly. "All right, lead." Bram did. He moved with painful urgency, not running blindly, but checking every few yards to make sure Eamon followed. They cut behind the cabin, through a narrow path between snow-laden pines. The wind was soft, but the woods held that deep winter hush that made every sound feel important. Boots breaking crusted snow, Bram's breath, a branch dropping its burden of white. The distance was not far, 200 yards. Maybe 300. Close enough that Eamon understood what had happened. Bram had not crossed miles by miracle. He had found the cabin because of smoke, light, and desperation. He had reached the only human close enough to help. That somehow made the whole thing more moving. A miracle was easy to admire. Survival was harder. Bram stopped at a narrow split in the ground where two low shelves of rock opened beneath the snow. In summer, it might have been nothing more than a creek cut, a place where meltwater moved under roots and stone. In winter, it had become a white trap. Bram stepped to the edge and whined. Eamon dropped to one knee. At first, he heard only wind passing through pine needles. Then, beneath it, thin as thread, came a sound. A small cry, weak, buried alive. Eamon aimed the flashlight downward. The beam caught snow, rock, ice, and then a shape at the bottom of the crevice, half covered and trembling. A German shepherd puppy lay below, no more than 7 weeks old, sable, furred and almost swallowed by the drift. Only the muzzle, one ear, and part of a tiny shoulder remained visible. Snow kept sliding down the narrow walls, dusting the little body like the world was trying to erase it gently. Eamon's throat tightened. The puppy gave another faint cry. Bram looked at Eamon, then back down into the crevice. His whole body shook now, not from cold alone. His paws dug into the snow. He wanted to go down, but the drop was too steep, the angle too narrow. He had done the only thing he could do. He had brought someone who still had hands. Eamon removed the rope from his shoulder and looped it around the nearest pine. His fingers moved quickly, tying the knot from memory. No wasted motion, no panic. The old soldier had returned, but the battlefield had changed. There were no bullets here, no smoke, no orders shouted through radios. Only a dog standing guard at the edge of the snow. Only a puppy fading below. Only an old man with a rope, a bad knee, and a heart he had tried very hard not to use. Eamon pulled the knot tight, then looked once at Bram. "Stay," he said. Bram lowered himself to the snow, eyes fixed on the crevice. Eamon tested the rope, breathed once, and swung one leg over the edge. The morning remained strangely bright around them, the pines green beneath their white crowns, the frozen lake shining somewhere beyond the trees. It should have been a peaceful winter morning. It should have been coffee, firewood, silence. Instead, Eamon Rusk lowered himself toward the small cry beneath the snow, and for the first time in years, the silence around him felt less like safety and more like a command waiting to be broken. Eamon Rusk did not rush down the crevice. Men who rushed in winter died in foolish ways. Ice did not care about courage, and snow had a quiet talent for hiding edges, holes, and mistakes. He braced one boot against the frozen rock, kept one hand locked around the rope, and lowered himself into the narrow cut while the morning light shone pale above him. The crevice was not deep enough to kill a grown man by height alone, but it was narrow, slick, and mean. Snow had drifted against one wall, soft on top and hard beneath. His right knee struck stone halfway down, and pain flashed up his leg with the bright, familiar cruelty of an old injury. Eamon swallowed it. Above him, Bram stood at the edge. The German shepherd's yellow-black coat was still crusted with snow, his old brown leather collar dark with meltwater. At 5 years old, Bram had the full strength and grave dignity of a working-line dog, but in that moment his amber-brown eyes held something almost childlike. Fear, yes, but not for himself. His ears leaned forward, his black muzzle pointed down, and every muscle in him seemed tied to the small cry below. "Stay," Eamon called. Bram obeyed, though the command cost him. His paws kneaded the snow at the rim. At the bottom, the puppy was half, buried against a lip of rock where loose snow kept sliding down. She was tiny, no more than 7 weeks old, with pale sable fur soaked flat against her ribs. One ear lay folded against her head. Her muzzle was cold, her eyes barely open, and her breathing came in little broken catches that seemed too fragile to belong to any living creature. Eamon cleared the snow from her chest with gloved hands, then pressed 2 fingers gently beneath her front leg. There, a heartbeat, thin, quick, fading. "All right," he whispered, and his voice sounded rougher than he intended. "Not today." He opened the front of his old dark gray black olive tactical shirt beneath his coat and tucked the puppy inside, against the warm base layer over his chest. She was so small she almost vanished there. Her body did not relax. It simply trembled, a tiny machine of fear and cold. When Eamon climbed back up, Bram met him with a sound that was not quite a whine and not quite a prayer. The big shepherd pressed his nose to the fold of Eamon's coat where the puppy lay hidden. "She's alive," Eamon said. Bram stared at him as if measuring the truth of it. She's alive, Eamon repeated, softer this time. Only then did Bram turn toward the cabin. The walk back felt longer than it had before. Snow kept whispering down from the branches. The frozen lake flashed between the trees like a blade under cloth. Eamon felt the puppy's faint tremor against his ribs, and something old stirred in him. Not panic, not exactly, but the terrible awareness of a life depending on the steadiness of his hands. He had carried grown men like this once. He had carried men whose blood steamed in cold air, men who cursed, men who begged, men who apologized to mothers who were not there. He had learned to move without letting grief reach his fingers. If grief reached the fingers shook. If the fingers shook, people died. But this was not a battlefield. This was a puppy no heavier than a loaf of bread. And somehow, that made it worse. Inside the cabin, heat rolled from the stove in a low golden wave. Eamon kicked the door shut behind him and moved straight to the hearth. He did not put the puppy close to the flames. Too much heat too quickly could harm what the cold had already weakened. Instead, he spread an old wool blanket on the floor, then another over his knees, and eased her out from inside his coat. Bram stepped close. Back, Eamon said. The shepherd stopped instantly, but his eyes never left the puppy. The cabin smelled of smoke, coffee, wet fur, and snowmelt. Water dripped from Bram's coat onto the pine floorboards. Eamon removed his gloves, warmed his hands near the stove, then touched the puppy again. Her paws were stiff. Her belly was cold. Her fur carried the clean, sharp scent of snow, and beneath it something else. Wood smoke, straw, and another dog. Not Stray. Then somewhere, someone had lost her. Eamon wrapped her in a towel and began the slow work of bringing her back. He warmed water, tested it against his wrist, then used a cloth to dampen her gums one drop at a time. No forcing, no panic. He had no puppy formula in the cabin, only evaporated milk, water, and a cautious memory from a field medic who had once claimed that every living thing, from soldiers to orphan dogs, survived first on warmth and patience. Bram stood guard beside him. The big shepherd had not eaten. He had not even looked at the bowl Eamon set down near the door. His whole attention remained fixed on the small bundle in the blanket. Once, when the puppy made a faint choking sound, Bram took one hard step forward, then stopped himself, shaking. Eamon looked up. "You know her?" Bram lowered his head. It was not an answer, not in the human sense, but it was enough. Eamon studied the dog more carefully now. Bram was not feral. His coat, though battered by snow, had been cared for. His nails were not overgrown. His collar had been worn for years, not recently thrown on to make him look owned. The scratched metal tag bore only his name on one side. The other side was too worn with ice and age to read clearly. A loyal dog, a lost puppy, a winter morning too quiet to be innocent. Eamon told himself not to build a story before he had facts. Then the puppy moved. Not much. Just one paw slipping from the towel, no bigger than two of his fingers. Her tiny pads pressed against the back of his hand. Bram leaned down and touched his black muzzle to that paw. The gesture was so careful, so heartbreakingly restrained, that Eamon went still. For a moment, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The big dog did not lick her wildly, did not crowd her, did not make noise. He simply touched her paw as if confirming she had crossed some invisible border back into the world. And the puppy, still half lost in cold, gave the smallest sigh. That was the moment Eamon understood. This was not just rescue, it was reunion. He looked away quickly, because the sight had struck some hidden bell inside him. There were things he had not allowed himself to miss, trust, need. The sacred absurdity of being chosen by another living creature. He had built his life like a locked room. Bram had not broken the door. Bram had brought a dying thing to the threshold and waited for Eamon to open it himself. "Don't look at me like that," Eamon muttered. Bram, who had been looking exactly like that, blinked once. The puppy swallowed a drop of warm liquid. Eamon let out a breath he had not noticed holding. "There you go," he whispered. "That's it." He worked for nearly an hour. Warmth. Water, rest. A few drops. More warmth. He checked her breathing, rubbed her gently through the towel, and kept her near his body when the shivering grew too violent. Bram finally accepted water from a bowl, but still refused food until the puppy managed 3 tiny swallows. Only then did Bram lower his head to the dish and eat. Eamon watched him from the chair beside the hearth. "Well," he said quietly, "that answers one question." Bram ate like a disciplined soldier, not like a starving stray. Slow, controlled, stopping every few seconds to look toward the blanket. Eamon almost smiled despite himself. "Fine, you're not an idiot. That makes one of us." The puppy slept after that, tucked into the wool folds in a shallow basket Eamon normally used for kindling. She looked absurdly small there, surrounded by things meant to burn. Her breathing steadied little by little. Bram lay beside the basket, his large body curved protectively around it, one ear lifted toward every sound in the cabin. The house changed around them. It did not become joyful all at once. Grief did not flee because one dog entered a room, nor did loneliness pack its bags at the first sign of muddy paws. But the cabin's silence loosened. It had been a hard silence before, disciplined and empty. The kind that stood in corners with its arms crossed. Now there was breathing in it. Bram's deep breath, the puppy's faint breath, the stove's warm breath. Eamon brewed a fresh cup of coffee he forgot to drink. He searched the old cabinet for a cardboard box, then thought better of it and found a wider laundry basket. He layered it with towels warm near the stove. He checked the front window twice, the tree line 3 times, and the weather report on the radio once. Snow would continue through the afternoon. The road into town would be poor until morning. He would not be taking the puppy anywhere today. He did not like that fact. He liked even less that a small part of him was relieved. By midday, the puppy woke enough to open her eyes. They were dark and cloudy with exhaustion, but alive. Bram lifted his head. Eamon sat forward, syringe in hand. "All right, little one," he said. "Let's find out if you plan to be difficult." The puppy made a tiny sound. It was not a bark. It was barely a complaint. But it had an opinion in it. Eamon's mouth twitched. "There she is." He did not name her right away. Names had weight. Names made things harder to surrender. He knew that. A nameless dog could be delivered to a shelter, reported to town, returned to whoever had lost her. A named dog began building a room inside a man before he noticed the walls going up, so he called her Little One for almost 3 hours. Then she sneezed into his palm. The sound was so small, so offended, so wildly unmilitary, that Eamon stared at her. Bram lifted his head. The puppy blinked as if the sneeze had surprised her too. Against his will, Eamon laughed. It was not loud. It was not graceful. It came out rough, almost broken, as if it had to crawl up from a buried place. But it was laughter. The room seemed startled by it. Eamon certainly was. He looked at Bram. "Don't repeat that." Bram's tail moved once against the floor. The puppy sneezed again. This time, Eamon covered his mouth, but the laugh escaped anyway. It sounded strange in the cabin, strange and living, like a bird flying through a church that had been locked for winter. He looked down at the puppy wrapped in the towel, at the pale sable fur drying in soft, uneven tufts, at the stubborn little nose that had chosen survival twice in one morning. "Nell," he said at last. Bram watched him. "Her name is Nell," Eamon repeated, as if making the decision official before some invisible committee could object. "Don't get sentimental. It's temporary." Bram rested his head beside the basket. That evening, snow turned blue beyond the windows. The forest faded into shadow. The stove burned low and steady. Eamon sat on the floor instead of the chair, because the basket was there, and because his back had decided to complain only after the crisis passed. Bram lay between him and the door. Nell slept in the basket, one paw twitching now and then in dreams, too small to name. Eamon should have felt invaded. His order had been disrupted. His floor was wet. His towel smelled of dog. His evening had become a medical watch, and his quiet had been filled with breathing that was not his own. But as the light dimmed and warmth gathered close to the hearth, he found the cabin did not feel smaller with them in it. It felt less hollow. Eamon reached out and placed 2 fingers lightly on Nell's back, feeling the tiny rise and fall beneath the towel. Bram opened one amber, brown eye, saw the hand there, and closed it again. "Temporary," Eamon said into the room. Neither dog argued. They did not need to. Outside, Winter kept its white grip on the world. Inside, beside the stove, an old soldier sat watch over two lives that had crossed his threshold without permission. And for the first time in years, Eamon Rusk did not measure the evening by what was missing. He measured it by what was breathing. By the third morning, the snow had stopped falling, though winter still held the forest in both hands. The world outside Eamon Rusk's cabin looked clean enough to forgive anything. Sunlight touched the white ground in thin gold lines. Pine branches bent under their soft burdens. The frozen lake beyond the trees gleamed pale blue beneath the sky, so clear it almost seemed merciful inside. The cabin had become a place Eamon no longer fully recognized. A towel hung over the back of a chair. A bowl of warmed water sat near the stove. A laundry basket lined with blankets occupied the best patch of heat by the hearth. Nell, the tiny sable German Shepherd puppy he had pulled from the crevice 2 days earlier, slept inside it with one paw tucked beneath her chin. Her breathing had grown stronger overnight, though her body still looked too small for the fight she had survived. Bram lay between the basket and the front door. The 5-year-old German Shepherd had dried into his true shape. Now broad, chested, yellow-black, powerful, without being heavy, with alert ears and amber, brown eyes that missed very little. His old brown leather collar, cracked and weathered, sat against the dark fur of his neck. He had the bearing of a dog who had known rules, work, and responsibility. Yet every time Nell shifted in her sleep, Bram lifted his head as if the whole cabin depended on that tiny breath continuing. Eamon stood at the sink, rinsing a spoon he had used to feed Nell a few careful drops of softened food. He had already told himself, at least 4 times that morning, that this was temporary. Temporary animals did not need a second blanket. Temporary animals did not need him checking their breathing before coffee. Temporary animals certainly did not need him speaking to them in a low voice while pretending not to. Bram's ears rose before Eamon heard anything. Then came a knock, soft, uneven, almost apologetic. Not the knock of a delivery driver, not the hard rap of law enforcement, not a neighbor with confidence in his welcome. It was the knock of someone who had learned to ask permission even from closed doors. Eamon dried his hands and crossed the room. Bram stood but did not bark. His tail did not wag either. He moved beside Eamon with a controlled urgency, his body angled toward the door, not threatening but deeply alert. When Eamon opened it, an old man stood on the porch. He was thin in the way winter makes honest men thinner. 78 perhaps, though hardship had carved a few extra years into him. He wore a gray wool coat worn shiny at the elbows, a knitted cap pulled low over sparse white hair, and mismatched gloves that looked chosen from a drawer in bad light. His face was narrow and pale, with high cheekbones, a soft mouth, and tired blue-gray eyes that had the watery brightness of someone who had not slept. He stood slightly tilted to one side, favoring his left hip, and his breath came in faint white clouds. But when he saw Bram, the old man's face changed. It was not surprise. It was recognition returning to a house after the lamps had been out too long. "Bram," the old man whispered. The German Shepherd stepped forward so fast, Eamon nearly reached for his collar. But Bram did not jump. He pressed his head into the old man's coat and stood there, rigid with feeling. The old man bent with difficulty, both hands sinking into the thick fur at Bram's neck. "Oh boy," he breathed. "Oh, good Lord, there you are." Behind Eamon, Nell stirred in the basket and made a small sound. The old man heard it. His eyes moved past Eamon into the cabin. The color left his face in one quiet wave. Eamon stepped aside. "Come in before you fall over." The old man obeyed because his knees seemed to have lost the argument. Inside, warmth closed around him. He removed his cap with both hands, revealing thin white hair combed carefully, despite the morning's worry. There was a gentleness in him, but not weakness. He had the manner of a man who had spent his life making small things with patient hands and had learned that shouting rarely fixed what careful work could repair. "My name is Caleb Wren," he said, voice trembling but polite. "I live north of here, about a mile through the trees." Eamon nodded once. "Eamon Rusk." "I know," Caleb said, then seemed embarrassed. "Folks in town talk, not badly. Just you know how small towns are. A man builds a cabin alone. People invent reasons. They can keep inventing. That almost made Caleb smile. Then Nell gave another little cry. Caleb turned toward the basket. Eamon watched him carefully. The old man approached as if walking toward a church altar, slowly, reverently. Bram followed at his side, shoulder brushing his knee. When Caleb saw Nell clearly, his breath caught. The puppy opened her eyes, unfocused at first, then fixed on him. Her tiny body strained forward. She was too weak to stand, but her tail moved once beneath the blanket. Caleb lowered himself to the floor with a pained sound he tried to hide. He reached one shaking hand into the basket. Nell pressed her muzzle against his fingers and made a soft, broken noise. The old man bowed his head. No sob came out, no dramatic cry. Only the kind of silence that fills when a heart breaks quietly because it has no strength left for theater. Eamon turned toward the stove and adjusted a log that did not need adjusting. He had never liked watching grief arrive. Grief recognized other grief. It raised its head like a dog smelling blood. Caleb sat back after a moment, wiping his face with the heel of his hand. Her mother was Mara, he said. Best dog my wife ever loved. Best dog I ever failed to deserve. Bram lay down beside the basket, his body curved protectively around Nell again. Caleb looked at him. And this one. Bram was Mara's guard before he was mine. 5 years old now. She raised him like he belonged to her. When she had Nell, he stayed beside the whelping box 3 nights straight. His voice softened. Wouldn't leave, not even for bacon. Eamon glanced at Bram. Questionable priorities. Caleb gave a fragile laugh, and the cabin warmed by 1/2 degree. He explained what had happened. The previous afternoon, several men from Pike Winter Access had come to his property. They had brought measuring poles, flags, a small gas-powered auger, and the kind of confidence men wear when they believe an old man has no one standing behind him. Their employer, Gideon Pike, wanted to develop a commercial snowmobile route through the North Woods. At first, the company had spoken kindly. They offered to help Caleb repair his roof and clear the lane if he signed a seasonal access agreement. Caleb had signed. He had believed it was temporary, a winter permission, a neighborly arrangement dressed in business language. But after that, orange survey stakes began appearing closer and closer to his porch. They said I gave them control of the North Access, Caleb said. 15 years. He swallowed. 15? I may not even have 15 years left, Mr. Rusk. Eamon said nothing, but his jaw tightened. Caleb continued. He had been recovering from pneumonia. His eyesight had worsened over the last year. The contract had been long, printed small, and presented by a smiling man with expensive gloves who kept saying, "Just standard paperwork, Mr. Wren." The words, standard paperwork, had never sounded more like a loaded weapon. When the workers came the day before, Bram had placed himself between them and the porch, not attacking, just standing. Nell had been inside a box near the stove, still young enough to stumble over her own paws. But the auger started, loud and sudden. One worker laughed. Another swung a measuring pole too close to the door. Bram barked. Nell panicked. Caleb had stepped outside too fast and slipped at the edge of the porch. By the time he pushed himself up, Bram had chased after Nell, who had bolted toward the trees. Snowfall swallowed their tracks before dusk. I searched until my hip gave out, Caleb said, then again at first light. His fingers tightened around his cap. I heard Bram's bark once in the woods, but the sound carried wrong. I thought I'd imagined it. Bram suddenly stood. His ears sharpened toward the window. A low sound came from his chest. Not a full growl, not yet, but something old and warning. Nell woke and lifted her head. Caleb stiffened as if an unseen hand had touched the back of his neck. Outside, far beyond the trees, an engine passed along the winter road. Not close, not threatening by distance alone. But Bram moved between Caleb and the window. Eamon saw it. The old man saw it too. For one suspended moment, the cabin seemed to gather around that single act, a dog who had already lost one safe place deciding, with the solemn authority of beasts and angels, that no stranger would take this one without being noticed. Caleb's eyes filled again, but this time the tears did not look helpless. They came back this morning, he whispered. Before I left, more stakes near the well. Eamon felt something cold settle in him, colder than snow and much cleaner than anger. He had met men like Gideon Pike before, not always in war, sometimes in boardrooms, sometimes in uniforms, sometimes in church pews. Men who discovered that cruelty did not need a raised fist if it had paperwork, a smile, and someone old enough to doubt himself. Caleb reached into his coat pocket with trembling fingers. "I can't take them home yet," he said. "Not with those men coming back. Not with the roof leaking and the stove acting up. Nell needs warmth. Bram won't leave her. And if Bram comes back with me, he'll stand against those men again, and his voice cracked. "I cannot bear to watch them punish him for loving me." He placed money on Eamon's table. $30, $120, $110. Both bills had been flattened carefully, as if Caleb had tried to iron dignity back into them with his hands. Eamon stared at the money. Caleb looked ashamed, but he did not look away. "It isn't enough, I know that, but I won't ask a man to carry my trouble for free." "You're not paying me," Eamon said. "I am asking you," Caleb replied, and there was a quiet steel beneath the age in his voice, "not to make me smaller than I already feel." That stopped Eamon. The cabin grew still except for the stove. There are moments when kindness can become pride in disguise. Eamon knew that. Refusing the money might make him feel noble, but it would leave Caleb standing there with nothing but need in his hands. So Eamon picked up the bills, folded them once, and slipped them under Bram's empty food bowl. "Advance payment," he said. "For dog rations, he eats like he outranks me." Caleb blinked, then laughed. A small, cracked laugh, but real. Bram, hearing his name or perhaps simply enjoying the improvement in the room, thumped his tail once against the floor. Eamon poured Caleb more tea. He asked no unnecessary questions. He did not promise to fix anything. Promises were easy currency, and he disliked spending what had not yet been earned. But he asked where the property line ran. He asked who witnessed the signing. He asked whether Caleb had a copy of the agreement. Caleb looked at him over the rim of the cup. For the first time since he arrived, something like hope moved across his face, cautious and frightened of itself. "I have papers," he said. "At the house. I don't know if they help." "Papers always help someone," Eamon said. "Question is who." When Caleb finally stood to leave, Bram rose with him. Nell whimpered from the basket, too weak to follow, but awake enough to know goodbye. Caleb bent and touched her head. "I'll come back," he told her. "You hear me, little girl? I'll come back." Bram walked him to the door. Outside, the old man pulled his cap low and stepped carefully down from the porch. His thin figure crossed the white clearing with the slow dignity of a man trying not to limp in front of witnesses. He did not look back until he reached the trees. When he did, Bram was still in the doorway. Caleb lifted one gloved hand. Bram did not bark. He only watched. Eamon stood behind the dog, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe. He had spent years telling himself other people's troubles were not his orders. He had earned peace. He had earned distance. He had earned the right to let the world handle its own damage. But peace that required ignoring an old man in the snow was not peace. It was surrender dressed as wisdom. He closed the door after Caleb disappeared into the trees. Inside, Nell had fallen asleep again. Bram returned to her basket and lay down, but his eyes remained fixed on Eamon. Eamon looked at the $30 beneath the bowl. Then he looked toward the north woods, where Caleb's house waited behind the pines, surrounded by orange stakes like warning flags on a battlefield no one had declared. "All right," Eamon said quietly. Bram lifted his head. Eamon reached for his coat. "Let's see how deep this goes." The next morning, Eamon Rusk went to Caleb Wren's house without a rifle. He took no weapon, no threats, no old military thunder dressed up as justice. A younger man might have gone looking for a fight. Eamon had survived enough fights to know that the cleanest battles were rarely the loudest ones, so he carried a small notebook, a tape measure, an old camera, and the kind of patience learned in places where one careless step could wake a buried mine. Bram walked beside him. The 5-year-old German shepherd moved with quiet purpose through the snow, his yellow-black coat bright against the white ground, his old brown leather collar dark against his thick neck. He kept close to Eamon's left side, but his eyes traveled constantly. Tree line, snowbank, road, cabin, Eamon's hand. Then back to the road again. Bram was not merely following. He was remembering. Nell stayed behind in Eamon's cabin, wrapped near the stove with food and water close by. She was stronger than before, but still too fragile for a cold walk through the woods. Eamon had left the radio playing low, as if a human voice might make the room feel less empty for her. He had told himself that was practical. It was not. Caleb's house stood about a mile north, tucked behind a bend of pines in a narrow lane that looked as if winter had nearly forgotten it. The place was small, old, and tired, but not abandoned. Its porch leaned a little. The back roof had been patched with dull tin. Blue curtains, faded almost gray by years of sun, hung in the windows. Smoke rose thinly from the chimney, the brave breath of a stove, trying harder than it should have to keep an old man warm. Caleb opened the door before Eamon knocked. The old man looked weaker in his own doorway than he had in Eamon's cabin. At 78, Caleb Wren carried age the way some men carried a sack of stones, quietly, without complaint. But with every step showing the weight, his white hair lay thin beneath a gray knit cap, his face pale and lined, his blue-gray eyes softened by grief and sleeplessness. He wore a brown wool sweater under a faded green winter coat, and his hands, long-fingered, knuckled, and slightly trembling, looked like they had shaped wood for decades and were still apologizing for not being stronger. Bram stepped forward. Caleb rested both hands on the dog's head. "Morning, boy." Bram pressed into him, then turned toward the yard. That was when Eamon saw the orange stakes. They stabbed through the snow in a crooked line across the property. One near the old well, two beside the woodpile, another near the narrow path that led to the back shed. They were too close to the house to be harmless, too deliberate to be mistaken. Bright orange against white snow. They looked almost cheerful, which made them uglier. Eamon began photographing them. He did not speak while he worked. He measured the distance from the stakes to the porch, from the porch to the well, from the well to the shed. He marked angles in his notebook. Caleb watched from the steps, shame folding his shoulders inward. "I thought it was just the edge of the land," Caleb said. "That's what Mr. Pike told me. Just survey work near the timberline." Eamon crouched beside one stake half, buried near the well. "This isn't the timberline." "No," Caleb said. "This is your life." Caleb looked away. Inside, the house smelled of cedar shavings, weak tea, wood smoke, and old paper. The walls were lined with carvings, birds, foxes, trout, little trees, tiny houses, and several German shepherds shaped from pine and walnut. Some were polished smooth. Some sat unfinished, their forms still sleeping inside the wood. On a shelf near the stove stood a photograph of Miriam Wren, Caleb's late wife. She had been a small woman with silver hair pinned back, kind eyes, and a face that looked as though it had spent years smiling at quiet things. In the picture, one hand rested on the head of Mara, a female German shepherd with a sable coat and calm, noble eyes. Bram, younger then, sat at Miriam's feet, already watchful. Eamon looked at the photograph longer than he meant to. Caleb noticed, but said nothing. Old Grief knew better than to interrupt another man's silence. At the kitchen table, Caleb brought out the contract. The pages had been folded and unfolded many times, the creases soft from worry. Eamon read slowly. He was not a lawyer, but traps had a smell, whether they were made of wire, sand, or ink. Terms like seasonal access, maintenance corridor, commercial passage, and extended easement sat inside the document like wolves wearing church clothes. He turned one page back, then forward again. "Where's the attachment?" he asked. Caleb blinked. "Attachment? It references Exhibit B." "I don't have an Exhibit B." Eamon looked up. Bram, lying near the stove, lifted his head as if the silence itself had changed flavor. Eamon took out his phone and made a call. By early afternoon, Tessa Ward arrived in a dark blue Subaru, with snow packed around the tires. Tessa was 34, tall enough to seem confident before she spoke, with a lean, practical build and the quick, alert posture of someone used to carrying too many responsibilities without dropping them. Her dark brown hair was tied low at the back of her neck. Her face was narrow, intelligent, and serious, but not cold. She wore a navy wool coat, dark jeans, black boots, and carried a worn leather document bag that had seen more winter roads than courtrooms. She was a lawyer in North Barrow, though people still called her Young Tessa, because small towns sometimes refused to let anyone grow up. When she stepped inside Caleb's house, she stopped. Her eyes had landed on a small wooden bird on the shelf near Miriam's photograph. It was a sparrow carved from pale wood, one wing slightly lifted as though it might fly if the room became quiet enough. Caleb followed her gaze. I made you one like that. Tessa's mouth softened. You gave it to me after my mother died. Eamon saw the change pass through her. Professional sharpness remained, but something deeper came under it. Memory gratitude, a wound that had learned to stand upright. I slept with it under my pillow for 6 months, Tessa said. I thought if a bird could stay whole after being carved, maybe I could too. Caleb looked down, embarrassed by kindness returning to him after so many years. Tessa sat at the table and read the contract. She did not gasp. She did not curse. Her anger was smaller than that and more dangerous. One finger tapped twice against the paper. Her eyes moved back to the line mentioning Exhibit B. This is incomplete, she said. Caleb swallowed. Does that mean I made a mistake? It means someone may have made one for you. They drove to the county records office before the light failed. Caleb insisted on coming, though his hip pained him. Bram stayed at the house this time, not because he wanted to, but because Eamon gave the command and Caleb needed him there. Eamon saw the old man steady himself before leaving, his hand resting on Bram's head like a man touching the last solid post in a flood. The county office was a 2-story brick building with old windows, tired flags, and a lobby that smelled of floor polish and paper. Behind the front counter sat Martha Bell. Martha was 61, slightly full in the face, with short silver-gray hair curled neatly around her ears and reading glasses hanging from a thin chain. She wore a burgundy cardigan over a cream blouse and had the careful, guarded expression of a woman who had spent 30 years knowing where every file was and which powerful people preferred certain files to stay asleep. She was not unkind, she was cautious. In small towns, caution often passed for survival. Tessa, Martha said. Mr. Wren, her eyes flicked to Eamon and measured him quickly. Old soldier, quiet trouble, but perhaps useful trouble. Tessa laid the contract on the counter. We need the recorded version. Martha's mouth tightened. This sounds like a civil matter. It may become more than that. I can only provide public records. I cannot take sides. Caleb removed his cap with both hands. His voice was soft. Martha, I don't need you to take my side. I just need to know what I signed. Something in Martha's face shifted. It was not dramatic. Just a small surrender of the eyes. She had known Caleb for years. There was one of his carved deer on her desk, polished by time and touched often enough to shine along the back. She disappeared into the records room. The wait felt longer than it was. Outside, afternoon snow began falling again, light and slow. Eamon stood near the window, watching the street, while Tessa paced once and then made herself stop. Caleb sat with his cap in his lap. When Martha returned, she carried a folder. Her expression had changed completely. There is an Exhibit B, she said. She placed a copy on the counter. Tessa read it first. Eamon watched her jaw set. Then she turned it so Caleb could see, though the old man's eyes struggled with the small print. The attachment granted Pike Winter access control of the North Access Lane for 15 years. 15 years. Caleb's hand trembled against the counter. I never saw this, he whispered. Tessa turned the last page. Caleb, what day were you hospitalized for pneumonia? January 10th. Martha looked down at the page. Her voice dropped. This is dated January 10th. For a moment, no one spoke. The snow outside seemed to fall more slowly. Eamon felt the old battlefield stillness come over him. Not fear, but clarity. One impossible detail could be an error. 2 could be carelessness. 3 began to look like design. Tessa took a slow breath. We'll need copies of everything. Martha hesitated only once, then nodded. I'll make them. That evening, Gideon Pike came to Caleb's house. He arrived in a black SUV that looked too polished for the road. Gideon was 49, tall and narrow, with silver blonde hair combed back so perfectly, it seemed arranged rather than grown. His face was handsome in a cold, bloodless way, clean, shaven, pale and smooth, with gray eyes that smiled only when his mouth needed company. He wore a charcoal turtleneck under a long graphite wool coat, dark trousers, expensive brown leather shoes, and black gloves soft enough to suggest he had never split his own firewood. He greeted Caleb warmly, too warmly. "Mr. Wren," Gideon said, stepping onto the porch as if he owned the angle of the boards. "I heard there was some confusion today." Eamon stood beside the door. Tessa stood near the table with the papers in her bag. Bram stood behind Caleb, silent and enormous. Gideon's gaze moved to Eamon. "Mr. Rusk, isn't it? The retired soldier living in the woods?" "Retired Navy SEAL," Eamon said. "But you can just call me the man reading your stakes." A faint line appeared near Gideon's mouth. "I'm sure you mean well," Gideon said. "But this is business. Development frightens people who don't understand it." "Funny," Eamon replied. "I was thinking the same thing about theft." Tessa looked down quickly, as if the floor had become fascinating. Gideon's smile held, but it lost warmth. "Be careful. Emotional interpretations can make simple matters expensive." Caleb lowered his eyes. That small movement did more to anger Eamon than any threat could have. Gideon looked back at Caleb. "You have a few days before the preliminary crew returns. I'd advise you not to turn a good opportunity into a public embarrassment." Bram gave one low rumble. Not loud. Not the same warning from before. This was deeper, controlled, almost mournful. Gideon looked at the dog and stepped back a fraction before pretending he had meant to. When the SUV finally left, the house seemed to breathe out. Tessa checked the window until the taillights vanished. Caleb sank into a chair. Eamon expected Bram to stay at the door, watching the road. Instead, the shepherd turned away, crossed the room, and went to the back wall near the hallway that led toward the rear shed. He stood there staring. Then he scratched once at the lower part of the wall. Caleb looked up slowly. "That wall backs onto the old woodshed," he said. Bram scratched again. Eamon followed his gaze. Through the small rear window, the shed sat under a white roof of snow, weathered and quiet, its door hanging slightly crooked. It was the kind of place where people stored broken tools, old blankets, and memories too painful to keep in the house. Bram did not bark. He simply stared, as if something behind that wall had called his name without making a sound. Eamon looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at the shed, and in the dim kitchen, with the false contract lying on the table and snow tapping softly at the glass, Eamon remembered an old truth from darker places. Some silences were empty. Others were guarding what mattered. By morning, North Barrow no longer looked innocent. The snow still shone clean over the roads, and the church steeple still wore its white cap like an old saint in winter. Smoke still rose from chimneys. The bakery still opened before dawn. Men still scraped frost from windshields with the same tired curses they had used for 20 years. But to Eamon Rusk, the town had changed. It had acquired edges. He saw them in the orange survey stakes near Caleb Wren's well. He saw them in the missing Exhibit B, in the date stamped on a paper Caleb could not possibly have signed, in the expensive calm of Gideon Pike's voice. The danger here did not wear mud on its boots. It wore polished shoes and spoken phrases like standard procedure that made it more dangerous, not less. Eamon drove Caleb to the veterinary clinic first. Nell lay bundled in a towel on Caleb's lap, her pale sable head resting against the old man's coat. Bram sat in the back seat of Eamon's truck, upright and watchful, his yellow-black body filling the space like a guardian carved from winter and command. He did not whine, he did not pace, but his amber, brown eyes flicked constantly between Nell, Caleb, and the passing road, as if he had taken responsibility for all three and found the burden acceptable. The clinic sat near the edge of town, a low brick building with frosted windows and a sign shaped like a paw print. Inside, it smelled of antiseptic, old coffee, and nervous animals. Dr. Lena Harrow met them in the exam room. She was in her early 40s, tall and spare, with auburn hair cut just below her jaw and tucked behind one ear, pale skin freckled across the nose, and steady green eyes that had learned to stay calm around pain. She wore navy scrubs beneath a gray fleece vest and moved with the efficient gentleness of someone who had delivered puppies at 3 in the morning and put old dogs to sleep at sunset, and still came back the next day because animals needed people who did not flinch. She examined Nell first. The puppy trembled on the metal table, but Caleb kept one hand near her nose, and Bram stood with his front paws on the floor, head level with the table edge, breathing slowly. Nell's eyes kept drifting toward him. Hypothermia, exhaustion, mild dehydration. Dr. Harrow said after a careful check. But no fractures, no frostbite severe enough to threaten tissue. She was found in time. Caleb closed his eyes. The relief that passed over his face seemed almost painful, as if hope had returned too suddenly and bruised him on the way in. Dr. Harrow looked at Bram next. She checked his paws, chest, ears, and old collar. He's tired and chilled, but he's built like a church door. Whoever raised him taught him discipline. Caleb touched Bram's head. Mara did most of that. At the sound of Mara's name, Bram's ears shifted. Eamon noticed. He noticed everything now, which irritated him. Caring made a man observant in the worst possible way. A week ago, he would have missed the small tremor in Caleb's fingers, the way Nell relaxed when Bram breathed near her, the way Bram became still whenever Mara was mentioned. Now every detail entered him like weather through a cracked wall. After the clinic, Tessa Ward met them at Caleb's house. The young lawyer had already filed a request for certified copies of the recorded documents. Her dark brown hair was tied low, wind-loosened strands brushing her cheek. She wore the same navy coat, but today her leather document bag was heavier, stuffed with copies, notepads, and the kind of quiet fury that did not need a raised voice. Martha Bell had called early. She had found older references in the county index, handwritten entries from before the office switched to digital records. Nothing complete yet, but enough to suggest Caleb's property had once been protected by an old access agreement. Which means, Tessa said, spreading papers across Caleb's kitchen table, Gideon Pike may have known exactly why he needed that Exhibit B. He wasn't just gaining a route. He was trying to erase the old route. Caleb sat at the table, hat in his hands. The old man looked smaller in daylight. His brown sweater hung loose at the shoulders. His pale face held the shame of someone who believed being tricked was proof of foolishness rather than proof of another man's cruelty. If Miriam were here, he said, she would have read every line. No one answered at first. The stove ticked in the corner. Bram lay near the door. Nell slept in a box lined with towels at Caleb's feet. Caleb stared at the contract. She always said I trusted voices too much. Said a man could smile with his mouth and steal with his hands. Tessa softened. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. Caleb rubbed his thumb over the brim of his cap. And I was an old fool who wanted the roof fixed before spring. Eamon set his coffee down. The cup landed harder than he intended. Trusting someone isn't foolish, he said. Caleb looked at him. Eamon's gray blue eyes were fixed on the papers, but his voice had gone quiet and cold. The way iron feels cold before it is heated. Using trust as a weapon, he said. That's the crime. The words settled over the room. Caleb did not speak again for a while. Tessa looked at Eamon as though she had just discovered a door in a wall she had mistaken for stone. Eamon disliked that look, so he stood. Show me where the crew's parked. Outside, the day had turned bright and sharp. Snow squeaked under Eamon's boots as Caleb led him toward the lane. Bram came with them. Nose low, tail level, body disciplined but tense. Eamon photographed tire tracks where Pike's crew had parked near the north access. He marked where the survey stakes bent around the well, where a machine had chewed at the frozen ground, where one boot print had crushed Caleb's small row of winter herbs beneath the kitchen window. No trespassing, no threats, no heroics, only evidence. That afternoon, Deputy Owen Laird arrived. Owen was 46, broad through the chest, but not heavy, with short dark brown hair, a square practical face, and tired hazel eyes that had seen too many neighbor disputes turn petty and too many real crimes hide inside family shame. He wore a dark winter police jacket over a gray blue duty shirt, tactical pants, and black boots salted white from the roads. He was not unkind, but caution had become his first language. In a small town, every decision had cousins. He listened while Tessa explained. Then he rubbed a hand across his jaw. I'm not saying nothing's wrong, but right now this is paper. Contract dispute, civil matter. Caleb lowered his eyes. Eamon's jaw worked once. Tessa touched Eamon's sleeve lightly, not to restrain him, but to remind him of the battlefield they were standing on. We understand, Deputy. That's why we're building the record. Owen looked at Caleb. Something in his face shifted. but not enough to become action. Bring me proof of forgery or coercion. Something more than confusion, then I can move. After he left, the house felt colder. Not because Owen had been cruel, because he had been reasonable. And reason, when it arrives without mercy, can feel like a locked gate. Evening came early. Caleb insisted on making tea, though. His hands shook. Tessa kept reviewing copies. Eyes, Eamon checked the back shed because Bram had scratched toward it the night before. But he found only old tools, stacked wood, a broken chair, and boxes sealed under dust. He did not force anything open. Not yet. A dog's interest was not a warrant. Nell woke near sunset. She had slept most of the day, but now she lifted her head and sniffed. Her small sable ears twitched. She pushed herself up on uncertain legs and stepped out of the towel. Lined box. Nell, Caleb said softly. Easy, girl. The puppy ignored the room. She walked toward the back hall. Bram rose immediately, but he did not stop her. He followed one slow step behind, his large head lowered near her tiny body. Nell reached the old woodshed door and pressed her nose to the crack beneath it. Then she made a sound Eamon had not heard from her before. Not fear recognition. Caleb went very still. That was Mara's corner, he whispered. Tessa looked up from the table. Caleb's voice had gone distant, as if memory had opened somewhere behind his eyes. Miriam kept an old blanket in there for her. Mara used to lie by the back wall when she was heavy with Nell. After Mara died, I stopped going in unless I had to. Felt wrong somehow, like walking into a room before someone finished praying. Nell scratched once at the door. Bram touched the same spot with his nose. The house held its breath. Eamon opened the shed door. Cold wood smell moved out, dust pine. Old wool. A trace of animal scent too faint for human certainty, but strong enough for Bram and Nell. The shed was narrow, dim, and crowded with the remains of a life. Carved scraps, broken crates, old jars of nails, a cracked sled runner, a workbench darkened by years of hands. Nell crossed the floor slowly. She did not wander. She did not sniff everywhere. She went to the back corner where two floorboards met beneath the workbench. There, she sat. Then she looked at Caleb. The old man's face changed, not understanding, not yet, but something close to fear. Eamon crouched beside the boards. One was warped slightly upward, its edge darkened by age. He ran his fingers along it and found old pry marks. Someone had lifted it before, long ago, then set it back with care. Tessa, he said. She joined him, cautious. What is it? Something was hidden here. Caleb's hand went to the doorframe. I don't remember, he said. But his voice did not sound certain. Eamon did not tear the floor open dramatically. He asked Caleb first. It was Caleb's house, Caleb's grief, Caleb's past. The old man nodded once. Eamon used a flat tool from the bench and worked the board loose. Beneath it sat a tin box wrapped in oilcloth. Caleb made a sound like his breath had struck stone. Miriam, he whispered. He lowered himself onto an old stool as Eamon lifted the box out. The oilcloth was brittle but dry. Inside the tin were several things arranged with the tender order of a woman who believed memory deserved protection. Mara's first leather collar, a small bundle of photographs, a folded letter tied with blue thread, and a stack of yellowed property papers. Tessa leaned closer. Eamon did not touch the letter. He handed the box to Caleb first. Caleb picked up Mara's collar. The leather was cracked, the little brass buckle dulled by time. Bram stepped forward and sniffed it once, then bowed his head so gently that no one in the room moved. Caleb's mouth trembled. She kept this, he said. Miriam kept everything that loved us. Nell curled beside his boot, exhausted by whatever instinct had carried her there. Tessa, careful and respectful, examined the papers only after Caleb nodded. Her eyes moved over the first page, then the second. On the third, she stopped. There's a reference number, she said. Eamon looked over her shoulder. The document was old, dated 1978. A hand-marked map of the north access lane and the boundary near Caleb's well. Near the bottom, written in faded ink, was a county filing number tied to something called a permanent residential access protection. Tessa's voice changed. Caleb, do you know what this is? No. It may be the original access protection for your property. If it was filed and never released, Pike can't simply control that lane through a seasonal commercial agreement. Caleb blinked, struggling to understand hope without trusting it too quickly. Does it save the house? Tessa did not lie. Not by itself. We need the official county copy. EY. This is a map and reference, but it tells us what to look for. Eamon looked toward the window. Snow had begun again, tapping softly against the glass. Tessa pulled out her phone and called Martha Bell. The call connected after 4 rings. Martha, Tessa said, I need you to check an old filing number for the north access near the Wren property, 1978. There was silence on the other end. Then Martha's voice came through, low and wary. That archive isn't digitized. I know. Another pause. I'll stay late, Martha said at last. At the county office, far across town, Martha Bell stood alone among steel cabinets and cardboard archive boxes, while the winter dark gathered against the windows. She had removed her reading glasses twice already to rub her eyes. The building's heat clicked through old pipes. Somewhere in the hall, a fluorescent bulb hummed like an insect trapped in glass. She looked down at the number Tessa had given her. Then she looked toward the locked archive room. For 30 years, Martha had kept records safe by keeping them orderly and untouched. Tonight, for the first time in a long while, she understood that some records were not meant to sleep. Back at Caleb's house, Nell had fallen asleep beside Mara's old collar. Bram lay near her, his amber eyes open in the dim light. Caleb sat with Miriam's unopened letter in his lap, one hand resting on the tin box as if it were a living thing returned from the snow. Eamon stood near the window, watching darkness settle over the orange stakes outside. For once, he did not feel the old pull toward isolation. The room behind him held a lawyer, an old man, 2 dogs, a dead woman's care preserved in a tin box, and a thread of truth thin enough to break if handled carelessly. But it was a thread, and Eamon had learned long ago that sometimes a man did not need the whole rope at first, only the first strand. The snowstorm arrived on the morning of the emergency hearing. It was not the kind of storm that tore roofs loose or buried cars like forgotten toys. It was quieter than that, steadier, almost ceremonial. Snow fell in thick white curtains over North Barrow, softening the church steps, blurring the stop signs, and turning the old courthouse windows into squares of yellow light. Eamon Rusk drove through it with both hands on the wheel. His old truck complained over every frozen rut, the heater coughing warm air into the cab like an elderly dragon with a bad lung. Caleb Wren sat in the passenger seat, wearing the best coat he owned, a dark brown wool coat with a frayed collar and buttons polished by years of use. His gray knit cap rested in both hands. He held it the way a man might hold a hymn book before a funeral. Bram sat in the back seat, broad yellow-black body upright, amber brown eyes fixed on the road ahead. Nell lay wrapped in a soft towel inside a small crate on Caleb's lap. The sable puppy was stronger now, but still small enough that every breath looked like something that needed protection. Tessa Ward followed in her blue Subaru, headlights glowing behind them through the snow. The courthouse was not grand. It was a 2-story brick building with white trim, old steps, and a bell tower that had not rung in years. Inside, the hallway smelled of wet wool, floor polish, old paper, and weak coffee. People spoke in low voices, as if the storm outside had entered with them and asked for respect. The hearing room had wood-paneled walls, a flag in one corner, and a heating system that knocked in the pipes every few minutes, like an impatient ghost. At the front sat Judge Harriet Vale. Harriet Vale was 66, a compact woman with silver hair cut neatly at her jaw and dark eyes that gave nothing away for free. She wore a plain black robe, small pearl earrings, and reading glasses that hung low on her nose when she reviewed documents. People in North Barrow said she could silence a room with one raised eyebrow. She had been a judge long enough to know that truth rarely entered dressed for the occasion. Most days, it came in tired, shaking, and carrying paperwork in a plastic folder. Gideon Pike arrived 5 minutes late, though somehow he made lateness look intentional. He wore a graphite wool coat over a charcoal turtleneck, black leather gloves, dark trousers, and polished brown shoes entirely unsuited to honest snow. His silver blonde hair was combed back with perfect control, and his clean-shaven face carried the calm smile of a man who believed rooms rearranged themselves around money. Beside him walked his attorney, Victor Sloan. Victor was 52, tall, narrow-shouldered, and smooth in a way that made him seem less like a man than a sharpened letter opener. His black hair was thinning at the temples, his face pale and precise, his wire-framed glasses spotless. He wore a dark tailored suit beneath a long black overcoat and carried a leather briefcase that looked expensive enough to have its own insurance. His voice, when he greeted the judge, was soft, polished, and empty of warmth. Caleb looked smaller when Gideon entered. Eamon saw it, Bram saw it too. The shepherd leaned gently against Caleb's knee, not enough to disturb him, just enough to remind the old man that he was not standing alone. Judge Vale began without drama. This is an emergency petition regarding the Wren property and contested access rights claimed by Pike Winter Access. I am not here today to try the entire matter. I am here to determine whether temporary relief is warranted while the underlying facts are investigated. Victor Sloan stood first. He spoke beautifully, which Eamon immediately distrusted. He described Pike Winter Access as a responsible local business hoping to create winter tourism, jobs, and safe marked routes for snowmobile traffic. He called the matter a misunderstanding. He called Caleb's concerns unfortunate but emotional. He called Tessa's petition an overreach built on sentiment. Gideon sat behind him, hands folded, the picture of injured reason. Eamon did not react. He had learned long ago that the enemy often wanted your anger because anger made your truth look unstable. Tessa rose next. She looked younger than Victor, less expensive, less polished. Her navy coat hung over the back of her chair. Her dark hair had loosened slightly from the snow, and there were shadows beneath her eyes from the night before. But when she spoke, her voice had the clean edge of a bell struck once. She placed Caleb's copy of the contract beside the county-filed version. "These are not the same document," she said. The room shifted. She showed the missing Exhibit B. She showed the 15-year access clause. She showed the hospital record proving Caleb had been admitted with pneumonia on the date the attachment was supposedly signed. Victor rose. "A clerical date error is hardly evidence of fraud." "No," Tessa said, "but it is evidence that the court should pause before allowing irreversible commercial activity on the property." Judge Vale wrote something down. Then Martha Bell stood. Martha looked nervous enough to crack, but she did not. She wore her burgundy cardigan over a cream blouse, her short silver, gray hair carefully curled, her reading glasses trembling slightly in one hand. She carried a folder against her chest like a shield. "I am the county records clerk," she said. "I located a filing from 1978 concerning permanent residential access protection for the Wren property's northern lane." Victor objected immediately, but Judge Vale allowed the document for the limited purpose of temporary review. Martha handed over the certified copy. Caleb stared at her as if she had walked through fire and returned carrying his name. Martha did not look at him. If she had, she might have cried. The judge read the document slowly. The room grew so quiet that Nell's tiny breath inside the crate seemed almost audible. Then came the moment that held the whole hearing by the throat. Tessa removed a small gray recorder from an evidence sleeve. Caleb's hand tightened around his cap. He used the recorder for reminders, she explained. Grocery lists, medicine times, wood delivery dates. On the afternoon Pike's crew had visited, the recorder had been left running on the kitchen shelf. Victor stood sharply. "We object to any edited or unverified audio." "So noted," Judge Vale said. "I will hear enough to determine relevance." Tessa pressed play. At first there was only static, wind, a door opening, the distant whine of a machine. Then voices emerged. A man laughed. Another voice said, "He doesn't understand the attachment anyway, just get him to sign the last page." A pause. Then Gideon Pike's voice, smooth and unmistakable. "Do not explain more than necessary. Older people become frightened when given too many choices." No one moved. The words did not sound like a gunshot. They were worse. They sounded ordinary, calm, practical. Evil wearing office shoes. Caleb closed his eyes. Bram rose, not barking, not lunging. He simply stood beside Caleb, tall and silent, his ears forward, his body forming a living wall between the old man and the room. And in that instant, Eamon saw Caleb's face change. The old man was still frightened, still frail, still outmatched in money and power. But shame left him. It did not vanish loudly. It slipped away like a thief caught in daylight. Caleb opened his eyes and looked at Gideon. For the first time, he did not look down. Judge Vale noticed. So did Gideon. Not a shouted accusation, not a sudden arrest, but the quiet resurrection of an old man's dignity. A dog stood beside him. A dead wife's papers lay before him, and one sentence on a recorder had turned confusion into something sharper, proof that his trust had been hunted. Deputy Owen Laird stepped forward next. He had stood at the back of the room until then, broad in his dark winter police jacket, his face square and sober, his hazel eyes tired but attentive. He was a man who trusted procedure because he had seen what happened when people skipped it. But procedure had finally given him a door to open. "Your Honor," Owen said, "my office received confirmation this morning from the notary listed on Exhibit B. The notary is under separate review and has stated he does not recall meeting Mr. Wren in person on the date in question. We have also received preliminary contact from a former Pike Winter Access employee willing to discuss company practices regarding elderly landowners." Victor's face tightened. Gideon's smile did not disappear. It became smaller, colder, and far less human. "This is outrageous," Gideon said, standing. Judge Vale looked over her glasses. "Mr. Pike, sit down." He did. Not because he wanted to, because for the first time that morning, the room no longer belonged to him. The judge took 10 minutes to review the documents. No one spoke. Snow tapped against the windows. Somewhere in the hallway, a door closed softly. Nell slept through all of it, tucked beneath Caleb's hand, as if the smallest soul in the room had already decided the adults could manage this part. When Judge Vale returned her attention to the room, her voice was calm. "The court is granting temporary injunctive relief. Pike Winter Access is ordered to cease all survey, construction, marking, and commercial preparation activity on the Wren property and disputed Northern Access Lane pending further review. All stakes and equipment are to be removed under supervision. The matter will be referred for investigation regarding potential document irregularities and improper execution." Caleb did not cheer. He simply breathed. One long breath, trembling at the edges. Eamon saw it and understood. Sometimes victory was not a raised fist. Sometimes it was an old man realizing he could go home without asking permission from the person trying to take it. Outside the courthouse, the storm had softened. Snow still fell, but the wind had eased. The streetlights glowed amber. People who had sat in the back of the hearing room drifted toward Caleb, awkward at first. A hardware store owner offered lumber at cost. A woman from church said she could send her sons to clear the lane. Martha Bell, red-eyed and embarrassed, promised to make additional copies of every record Caleb needed. Community did not become holy all at once. It shuffled forward in wet boots, unsure what to say, carrying small offerings. Caleb stood under the courthouse awning with Nell in his arms. The puppy tucked her nose into his coat. Bram stood beside Eamon, chest lifted, looking absurdly proud for a dog who had technically filed no paperwork. Caleb looked at the falling snow. "I thought home was wood, nails, a roof," he said quietly. "Turns out sometimes home is what other people help you remember." Eamon did not answer right away. He looked at the town, at Tessa packing her papers, at Martha wiping her glasses, at Owen speaking into his radio, at Gideon's black SUV waiting at the curb like a dark thought that had lost its argument. Then Bram put both muddy front paws against Eamon's old tactical shirt. Two perfect prints landed on the faded gray, black olive fabric. Eamon stared down. "You just contaminated a key witness," he said. Tessa, passing behind him, said, "Actually, Nell was the key witness." Eamon looked at Bram. "You hear that?" demoted. Bram wagged his tail once, fully satisfied with his rank. The laughter that followed was small, but it moved through the group like warmth under a door. Gideon Pike's SUV pulled away without ceremony. No handcuffs, no dramatic collapse. Only a man who had arrived certain and left summoned, watched, and no longer invisible. Eamon drove Caleb home through the snow. When the old house appeared between the pines, its windows glowing gold, Caleb leaned forward slightly. The orange stakes still stood in the yard, but now they looked temporary, harmless, almost, like bad ideas waiting to be removed. Caleb did not look at the house as a thing slipping from his hands anymore. He looked at it like a man seeing his own name carved back into the door. 3 weeks later, winter still held North Barrow in white hands, but the cold no longer seemed cruel. Snow remained on the roofs, Ice still glazed the edges of the roads. The pines still bowed under their bright burdens, and the lake beyond Eamon Rusk's cabin still lay frozen beneath a pale northern sky. Yet something had changed in the way the world looked. The same snow that once seemed to cover loss now looked like a clean page waiting for a trembling hand to begin again. Caleb Wren's house was still old. No court order could make a roof new overnight. No judge's signature could straighten a leaning porch or repair 20 winters of wind. But the orange stakes were gone. Pike Winter Access had removed them under Deputy Owen Laird's supervision. Each bright marker pulled from the snow like a bad tooth. The house breathed easier without them. People in town began arriving in small, awkward waves. No one called it charity, because Caleb would have shut the door on that word. They called it extra lumber, spare time, leftover shingles, a ride into town, a pot of stew that happened to be too large for one family. Nolan Price, the owner of the hardware store, came by with roofing nails and tar paper. Nolan was a round-shouldered man in his late 50s, with a red face, a gray mustache, and the bashful manner of someone who preferred helping from behind a counter rather than being thanked in person. He claimed the supplies were damaged inventory, though the labels were clean and new. Martha Bell brought copies of every property record Caleb might need, placed neatly in a folder with blue tabs. She did not stay long, but before she left, she touched the carved deer on Caleb's shelf and said, "I should have looked sooner." Caleb told her, "You looked when it mattered." That was enough to make her eyes shine behind her reading glasses. Tessa Ward came twice a week, still wearing her navy coat and carrying her old leather document bag. She never made her work sound heroic. She called it paperwork, filings, motions, boring things, but Eamon noticed the way Caleb stood straighter after she left. Deputy Owen Laird helped remove the last of the stakes near the well. He said little, as usual, but before leaving, he rested one hand on the porch rail and told Caleb, "If anyone from Pike comes back without authorization, you call me first." For Owen, that was nearly a sermon. Gideon Pike had not been dragged away in handcuffs like a villain from a cheap story. Life rarely tied its endings that neatly. His company remained under investigation. The questionable notary was cooperating. A former employee had given a statement about how Pike Winter Access targeted elderly landowners with complicated contracts. Gideon's name had begun appearing in local conversations with less admiration and more caution. It was not perfect justice, but it was motion. And sometimes motion was the first honest mercy. Caleb began carving again. At first, his hands shook too badly for fine detail. He cursed the wood, then apologized to it, which made Eamon suspect the old man had been alone too long, even by Eamon's standards. But by the second week, small shapes began emerging on the workbench. A sparrow with one wing lifted, a pine tree bent by snow, and finally a German shepherd with a noble head, upright ears, and a chest too proud for the size of the block. "That Bram?" Eamon asked one afternoon. Caleb held the carving up and squinted. "It was supposed to be. Looks like a bear applying for military service." Caleb coughed so hard from laughing that Nell woke in her blanket basket and barked one offended little bark. Nell had healed into puppyhood with surprising force. Her pale sable fur had dried soft and uneven, her ears still undecided about standing, her paws too large for her small body. She followed Caleb from room to room, bumping into chair legs, chewing wood shavings when no one watched, and falling asleep wherever the old man had last stood. She belonged to that house the way a candle belongs to a window. Bram, however, had become more complicated. The 5-year-old German shepherd still obeyed Caleb. He still greeted the old man with deep affection, pressing his head into Caleb's coat and closing his amber-brown eyes in contentment. Yet whenever it was time to leave, Bram walked to Eamon's truck before anyone called him. At Eamon's cabin, he slept near the door. He watched Eamon split wood. He sat beside him at the window during morning coffee, silent as a carved guardian. Eamon refused to discuss what that meant. He used words like practical, temporary, and arrangement, words that sounded sensible and fooled no one. The day came when Caleb was strong enough to keep Nell full. Time the roof had been patched, the stove repaired, the lane cleared. Pike's men were gone, at least for now. Tessa had filed the protections. Owen had made his warning clear. The house was not young, but it was safe enough to hold an old man and a puppy again. Eamon loaded the truck that morning with more care than necessary. He packed Nell's towel, a small bag of food, the medicine Dr. Lena Harrow had prescribed, and a little wooden shoe Caleb had carved for her. Bram stood beside the truck, watching him. The shepherd's yellow-black coat was brushed clean, his leather collar oiled, his metal tag no longer hidden by ice. He looked less like a stray messenger from the storm now, and more like what he had always been, a working dog with a heart trained toward duty. Eamon avoided his eyes. The cabin felt too large before they even left. At Caleb's house, Nell knew first. The moment Eamon opened the truck door, the puppy scrambled toward the porch with clumsy joy. Caleb knelt carefully, arms open, and Nell tumbled into him, pressing her muzzle into his chest, as if returning to a song she had heard before birth. Caleb held her with both hands and bowed his face into her fur. No one spoke. Some moments were too honest for commentary. Bram stepped down from the truck last. He walked to Caleb, touched his muzzle to the old man's sleeve, then stood back beside Eamon. Caleb saw it. So did Eamon. "No," Eamon said before anyone else could turn the truth into words. "He's yours." Caleb stroked Nell's head, his eyes still lowered. "He was Mara's first, then mine now." He looked at Bram. "Now I think he has chosen his post. He's a dog," Eamon said. Caleb smiled faintly. "That is usually how God gets past men who think they are too clever to be rescued." Eamon frowned. "I don't need rescuing." Bram chose that exact moment to lean his full weight against Eamon's leg. Eamon shifted to keep his balance. Caleb's smile widened. "No, clearly not." The humor softened the pain, but did not remove it. Eamon looked down at Bram, at the old collar, the steady eyes, the quiet patience. He had spent years believing love meant losing something later. He had called distance wisdom. He had called loneliness peace. But Bram had walked through snow, brought him to Nell, stood beside Caleb, slept at his door, and waited without once asking Eamon to explain himself. Caleb reached into his coat and took out something small wrapped in cloth. He handed it to Eamon. Inside was not money, not paperwork, not a medal or a reward. It was a carved wooden key, simple and warm from Caleb's palm. On one side, Caleb had carved a tiny German shepherd paw. On the other, a pine tree beside a cabin. "Miriam used to say," Caleb said quietly, "some doors open from the outside only once. After that, a man has to learn to open them himself." Eamon stared at the key. His throat tightened in a way that made speech feel unsafe. Caleb nodded toward Bram. "Keep him. Not as payment, not as thanks, as a reminder." Eamon wanted to refuse. Pride rose first, as it always did, like an old guard dog of his own. But Bram looked up at him, calm and certain. Nell barked once from Caleb's arms, as if casting her vote. Eamon closed his hand around the wooden key. "All right," he said. It was the smallest surrender of his life. It felt like victory. From then on, the two houses were no longer lonely islands in the snow. Every few days, Eamon and Bram walked the mile through the pines to Caleb's place. Sometimes Eamon carried firewood. Sometimes he fixed a hinge, tightened a loose rail, or cleared ice from the well cover. Sometimes he did nothing useful at all, which bothered him at first, until Caleb told him sitting at a table drinking coffee was useful if a man had forgotten how. Bram and Nell became a strange little family divided by trees but not by distance. Bram would lie on Caleb's porch while Nell climbed over his paws, chewed his ear, and treated his patience as public property. He endured her with the solemn misery of a decorated officer assigned to nursery duty. Eamon began sleeping better, not every night, not magically. The past did not vanish because a dog occupied the floor beside the bed. Some nights still came sharp, edged. Some dreams still carried smoke, shouting, and the faces of men he could not save. But when Eamon woke reaching for a weapon that was no longer there, Bram lifted his head from the rug and breathed deep. Slowly in, out, a rhythm old as trust. Eamon learned to follow it. One bright morning near the end of winter, Eamon sat at his front window with black coffee cooling in his hand. Bram lay beside his chair, ears relaxed, one paw resting on the wooden key Caleb had carved. Outside, sunlight turned the snow to silver fire. Far down the path, Two shapes appeared between the pines. Caleb came slowly, leaning on his cane, his patched coat buttoned crookedly. Nell bounded ahead of him, bigger now, her sable ears trying bravely to stand. She ran 3 circles in the snow before tripping over her own paws. Bram rose at once. He went to the window and placed his front paws gently against the glass. Once, weeks ago, Bram had done that as a desperate plea in a frozen world. This time, Eamon stood before the first scratch came. He opened the door. Cold air entered. So did morning. So did Caleb's laugh from the path, Nell's delighted bark, and Bram's warm body brushing past him into the snow. Eamon stepped onto the porch. For years, he had believed peace meant no one calling his name. Now he understood better. Peace was not an empty cabin. Peace was a door that could open. A dog that knew where home was. An old man coming through the trees. A puppy carrying winter in her paws and joy in her clumsy little heart. Eamon looked at the carved wooden key in his hand, then at Bram waiting in the snow, and for the first time in a long while, he did not wonder what the silence had taken from him. He saw what had answered it. In the end, Eamon learned that peace is not always found by running far from the world. Sometimes peace comes when the right soul finds our door, scratches gently at the glass, and reminds us that a closed heart can still become a home. Bram did not arrive with thunder. Nell did not bring a miracle wrapped in light. Caleb did not ask to be saved like a man in a storybook. Yet through one loyal dog, one fragile puppy, and one old man's quiet dignity, God placed a small miracle in the middle of an ordinary winter. Maybe that is how grace often works. Not always through grand signs, but through small mercies. A hand offered at the right time, a neighbor who finally speaks up, a dog who refuses to leave, a door that opens when someone needs warmth. In daily life, many people carry silent battles. Some are lonely. Some are ashamed of mistakes. Some are tired from being strong for too long. But this story reminds us that no life is too cold for love to enter, and no heart is too far away for God to reach. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or tell us about an animal that changed your life. And if you believe in loyalty, second chances, and the quiet miracles God sends through his creatures, please subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories. May God bless you, protect your family, comfort your heart, and guide your steps with peace.